Welcome to a documentary unlike any other. Over the next several hours, we're going to travel the world, from small-town cemeteries in the American heartland to grand cathedrals in Europe, from windswept islands in the South Atlantic to the blazing deserts of California. And we're going to tell you the stories of 40 famous people whose bodies, after death, were not left in peace. These are stories of grave robbery, stolen organs, bodies moved across continents, posthumous trials, lost remains, and family feuds that lasted longer than some of the lives themselves. You'll hear about a president whose coffin was pried open by counterfeiters in the middle of the night, a silent film legend whose body was held for ransom in a Swiss cornfield, a physicist's brain carried around in a mason jar for 40 years, a pope's rotting corpse propped up on a throne and put on trial. Some of these names you'll know well, others may surprise you. All of them share one thing in common. Death was not the end of their story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one they never got to write. Let's start with the biggest name we could possibly start with. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington. He died the next morning at a boarding house across the street. He was 56 years old. The 16th President of the United States, the man who preserved the Union and ended slavery, had seen the war through to its conclusion. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox just 5 days earlier, only to be killed before he could enjoy the peace he had fought so hard to win. The nation plunged into mourning on a scale never before seen in American life. Lincoln's body traveled by funeral train from Washington to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, a journey of nearly 1,700 miles over 13 days, with stops for public viewing in cities along the route. An estimated 1 million people lined the tracks or viewed the coffin in city halls, state capitals, and public squares. At every stop, church bells tolled and buildings were draped in black. He was accompanied in the coffin car by the previously exhumed remains of his son Willie, who had died of typhoid fever at age 11 in the White House 3 years earlier, and would be reburied alongside his father. It was the first great shared national grief in American history, made possible by the railroad and the telegraph, two technologies that Lincoln himself had championed. He was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, in a grand tomb befitting his stature, and by all rights, that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 11 years later, in 1876, a gang of Chicago counterfeiters hatched a plan to steal Lincoln's body and hold it for ransom. They wanted $200,000 and the release of their best engraver, Benjamin Boyd, from prison. On the night of November 7th, two of the conspirators, Jack Hughes and Terrence Mullen, broke into the tomb, partially pried open the marble sarcophagus, and began dragging the coffin out. What they didn't know was that the Secret Service had been tipped off. Agents were waiting in the shadows. The grave robbers fled into the night, but were captured days later. In the aftermath, Lincoln's friends realized how vulnerable the body was. They moved his coffin to a hiding place between the walls of his tomb, known only to a small group of trusted men. For years, Lincoln lay in an unmarked spot within his own monument. When the tomb was rebuilt in 1901, his son Robert insisted that his father be placed in a steel cage and buried under 10 feet of concrete, so deep that no one could ever disturb him again. Today, visitors to Lincoln's tomb in Springfield walk across that concrete floor without knowing it. The man who saved the nation rests about as securely as any person in history, because his friends made sure of it. From the prairies of Illinois, let's travel south, a long way south, to Buenos Aires, Argentina. If Lincoln's body nearly left its tomb, the next person on our tour spent more than 2 decades being moved from country to country, hidden in attics and vans, buried under a false name, and kept in a dining room. No body in modern history has had a stranger journey than this one. Eva Perón, Evita, as millions knew her, was the wife of Argentine President Juan Perón and the most beloved political figure in the country's history. Born in poverty in a small village on the Pampas, she had come to Buenos Aires as a teenager with dreams of becoming an actress. She found some success on the radio and in film before meeting Colonel Juan Perón at a charity event in 1944. Their partnership transformed Argentina. As First Lady, Eva became the champion of the descamisados, the shirtless ones, the working poor, establishing charitable foundations, pushing for women's suffrage, and wielding a degree of political influence unprecedented for any Argentine woman. She was adored by millions and despised by the Argentine establishment. When she died of cervical cancer on July 26, 1952, at just 33 years old, the grief was staggering. Crowds filled the streets of Buenos Aires, and the government declared a month of national mourning. Her body was embalmed by a Spanish pathologist named Pedro Ara, who spent over a year perfecting the preservation. The plan was to build an enormous monument, larger than the Statue of Liberty, to house her remains. But in 1955, before the monument could be completed, a military coup overthrew Juan Perón and sent him into exile. The new military government was terrified that Evita's body could become a rallying point for her supporters. They seized it. What followed was one of the strangest odysseys any corpse has ever taken. The embalmed body was hidden in a series of locations around Buenos Aires, behind a movie screen in a cinema, in a crate marked as radio equipment, in a military intelligence building, and reportedly even in a van parked on a city street. Eventually, in 1957, the military secretly shipped her body to Italy and buried it in a Milan cemetery under the false name Maria Maggi. She lay there, unidentified, for 14 years. In 1971, the Argentine government finally revealed the body's location and returned it to Juan Perón, who was then living in exile in Madrid with his third wife, Isabel. According to several accounts, he kept the coffin in his dining room. When Perón returned to power in Argentina in 1973, Evita's remains came with him, though it would take until 1974, after Perón himself died, for her body to finally reach its permanent resting place, a fortified crypt in La Recoleta Cemetery in Buenos Aires, buried 20 feet underground in a vault designed to withstand a nuclear blast. The journey from death to final rest had taken 22 years. Now let's leave the world of politics entirely. Our next story has nothing to do with revolution or national grief. It's about one man's obsession with the most famous brain on Earth, and a theft so brazen it sounds made up. When Albert Einstein died of a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm at Princeton Hospital on April 18, 1955, he was 76 years old and the most famous scientist on the planet. He had left clear instructions: cremate the body and scatter the ashes secretly so that no one would come to worship at his grave. His family carried out the cremation and scattered his ashes along the Delaware River at an undisclosed location. But there was a problem. By the time the cremation happened, something was already missing. Dr. Thomas Harvey, the pathologist who performed Einstein's autopsy, had removed the physicist's brain without permission. He simply took it. When Einstein's son, Hans Albert, found out a few days later, he was furious, but Harvey managed to convince him to allow the brain to be kept for scientific study, on the condition that any findings would be published only in reputable scientific journals. Harvey agreed. Then he proceeded to do almost nothing with it for decades. He sliced the brain into approximately 240 pieces, mounted many of them on microscope slides, and then carried them around with him for the next 40-odd years. The brain traveled in mason jars, in a cider box under a beer cooler, in car trunks, and in cardboard boxes, from Princeton to Philadelphia, to Wichita, Kansas, to Lawrence, Kansas. Harvey lost his position at Princeton Hospital, lost his medical license after failing a competency exam in 1988, and at one point worked on an assembly line in a plastics factory. All the while, he had the brain of the century's greatest physicist stashed in his closet. A journalist tracked Harvey down in 1978 and found him in Wichita with the brain under a beer cooler. The first study of Einstein's brain wasn't published until 1985. 30 years after the theft. In 1998, the elderly Harvey finally returned the remaining uncut portion of the brain to Princeton. Einstein's ophthalmologist Henry Abrams had also taken Einstein's eyes during the autopsy. They reportedly remained in a safe deposit box in New Jersey for decades. Today, slices of Einstein's brain can be seen at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia and the National Museum of Health and Medicine. The man who wanted to be forgotten got the opposite. His brain became one of the most examined objects in modern science, all because a pathologist couldn't resist the temptation. From a stolen brain, let's turn to a stolen body, and a crime so bumbling that even the victim's widow couldn't help but see the humor in it. Charlie Chaplin, the legendary silent film star whose Little Tramp character made him arguably the most famous person in the world during the 1910s and 1920s, died on Christmas Day, 1977, at the age of 88. His career had spanned more than 6 decades, from the silent era through the coming of sound. He wrote, directed, produced, scored, and starred in films that remain masterpieces: City Lights, Modern Times, The Great Dictator, The Kid. He had survived scandals, political persecution, and the accusation that he was a communist sympathizer, an accusation that led the United States to effectively exile him in 1952 when the government revoked his re-entry permit while he was traveling to London for a premiere. Chaplin settled in Switzerland with his 4th wife, Una O'Neill, the daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill, whom Chaplin had married when she was 18 and he was 54. Their marriage lasted 34 years and produced 8 children. It was in Switzerland, near Lake Geneva, in the quiet village of Coursier-sur-Vevey, that Chaplin found peace at last. His family buried him in a small cemetery there, and for 2 months all was quiet. Then, on March 1st, 1978, his body was stolen. 2 men, Roman Wardus, a 24-year-old Polish mechanic, and Gancho Ganev, a 38-year-old Bulgarian, dug up Chaplin's coffin in the night and reburied it in a cornfield about a mile from the Chaplin family home. They then contacted Una and demanded $600,000 for the return of the body. Una refused. Charlie would have thought it rather ridiculous, she said. The thieves then threatened the couple's 2 youngest children. Swiss police tapped Una's phone and stationed officers at 200 public phone booths in the region. When Wardus and Ganev made their next call, they were caught. Both men were political refugees who had come to Switzerland looking for work and found very little. Wardus, identified as the mastermind, was sentenced to 4.5 years of hard labor. Ganev received an 18-month suspended sentence. Both wrote letters of apology to Una, who was reportedly ready to forgive them. Chaplin's body was recovered from the cornfield and reburied in a concrete-reinforced grave to prevent any future attempts. He remains there today in Coursier-sur-Vevey, this time for good. Chaplin's grave robbers at least had the decency to wait until he was dead. The next man on our tour wasn't so lucky. His corpse was dug up, put on trial, hanged, and beheaded. 3 years after he died, Oliver Cromwell led the parliamentarian forces in the English Civil War, oversaw the trial and execution of King Charles I in 1649, one of the most shocking events in European history, the first time a reigning monarch had been publicly tried and beheaded by his own subjects, and ruled England, Scotland, and Ireland as Lord Protector until his death on September 3, 1658, at the age of 59. He died of what modern historians believe was either malaria or a urinary tract infection that led to septicemia. Cromwell was buried in Westminster Abbey with full state honors in a funeral ceremony of extraordinary pomp near the crypt of Henry VII. His son Richard briefly succeeded him as Lord Protector, but Richard lacked his father's iron will and political cunning. The Republic collapsed, and the monarchy was restored under Charles II in 1660. The new king's parliament was not in a forgiving mood. In January of 1661, on the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution, they ordered the posthumous execution of Cromwell, along with 2 other men who had signed the king's death warrant, Henry Ireton and John Bradshaw. The 3 corpses were exhumed from Westminster Abbey, dragged through the streets of London on sledges to the gallows at Tyburn, and hanged in chains from morning until 4 in the afternoon, before a crowd that had come to witness the grim spectacle of royal revenge. Then Cromwell's head was severed. It reportedly took 8 blows of the axe, and impaled on a 20-foot spike above Westminster Hall, where it served as a warning to would-be revolutionaries. The head stayed on the spike for more than 20 years. Tradition says it was blown down during a storm in the 1680s and picked up by a sentry who hid it in his chimney. After that, Cromwell's head passed through the hands of private collectors, curiosity dealers, and exhibitors for nearly 3 centuries. A French-Swiss collector displayed it alongside a 16-foot snakeskin and a religious idol with a donkey's head. An actor named Samuel Russell reportedly passed it around at parties. The Wilkinson family eventually acquired it in the early 1800s and kept it for generations, occasionally allowing scientists to examine it. In 1960, it was finally buried at Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, Cromwell's old alma mater, where he had studied as a young man before going on to reshape English history. The exact burial location within the college grounds has been kept secret to prevent any further disturbance. From death to final rest, 302 years. Cromwell's admirers wanted his head as a warning. The admirers of our next subject wanted something more personal, his fingers. And there's a dark poetry in which finger ended up on display. Galileo Galilei, the Italian astronomer who confirmed that the Earth revolves around the Sun and not the other way around, died on January 8, 1642, at the age of 77. He was blind, under house arrest for heresy by the Catholic Church, and largely broken. Because the Church still considered him a heretic, he was quietly buried in a small room next to the chapel of Saints Cosmas and Damian, in the Basilica di Santa Croce in Florence, not in the main body of the church, where a grander tomb was planned. 95 years passed before his remains were finally moved to that grand mausoleum. On March 12, 1737, as Galileo's body was being transferred, a group of admirers, including the antiquarian Anton Francesco Gori, the anatomist Antonio Cocchi, and the Marquis Vincenzo Caponi, decided to help themselves to souvenirs. They removed 3 fingers, a tooth, and a vertebra from the body. The fingers they took were the ones he would have used to hold a pen. There is a deliberate irony in the fact that these body parts were treated like sacred relics of a saint, preserved in glass and venerated, when Galileo had been condemned by the very institution that invented the practice of relic worship. The middle finger of his right hand is now on display at the Museo Galileo in Florence, encased in an ornate gilded glass egg. 2 other fingers and the tooth vanished for over a century, resurfacing at auction in 2009 and eventually reuniting with the middle finger at the museum. The vertebra went to the University of Padua, where Galileo once taught, and remains there today. Galileo's body, minus a few parts, rests in Santa Croce near the tomb of Michelangelo. In a museum dedicated entirely to scientific instruments, his middle finger is the only human body part on display. The museum describes it as exemplifying the celebration of Galileo as a hero and martyr of science. Some visitors have noted an additional irony. The finger that's on display is his middle finger, forever pointing upward, which, depending on your perspective, could be seen as a final gesture toward the institution that persecuted him. Galileo lost fingers. The next man on our tour lost something rather more personal, and what happened to it afterward is one of the more colorful stories in the history of human anatomy. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican artillery officer who crowned himself Emperor of France, conquered most of Europe, and reshaped the map of the continent before his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, died in exile on the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. He had spent his final 6 years on that windswept rock, 1,000 miles from the nearest continent, guarded by British troops and growing increasingly ill. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, though debates about arsenic poisoning have persisted for 2 centuries. Elevated arsenic levels were found in samples of his hair in the 1960s, though some researchers attribute this to the arsenic-based pigments in the green wallpaper of his room at Longwood House. During the autopsy, attended by no fewer than 17 people, including 8 physicians, someone, most likely either the attending physician, Francesco Antomarchi, or Napoleon's chaplain, Ange Paul Vignali, removed certain body parts. Among the items allegedly taken was a piece of tendon, fragments of a rib, and, according to persistent historical accounts, Napoleon's penis. The Vignali family kept the collection for years. After the chaplain was killed in a blood vendetta in Corsica, the items passed to his relatives and eventually made their way to London antiquarian booksellers in 1916. In 1927, the supposed organ was briefly displayed in New York City at a Manhattan auction house, where a contemporary description in a Time magazine review compared it to a piece of beef jerky. It failed to sell. It was eventually purchased in 1977 by Dr. John Latimer, a prominent urologist and collector of historical oddities who also owned Abraham Lincoln's blood-stained collar. Latimer kept the item in a briefcase under his bed in New Jersey and declined all requests to view it. After Latimer's death in 2007, possession passed to his daughter. Napoleon's body itself was exhumed from St. Helena in 1840, 19 years after his death, and returned to France in an elaborate ceremony known as the Retour des Cendres. King Louis-Philippe sent a ship to retrieve the emperor's remains, and when the coffin was opened on St. Helena, witnesses reported that Napoleon's body was remarkably well preserved. He now rests in a magnificent porphyry sarcophagus at Les Invalides in Paris, the grandest tomb in France, set within 6 concentric coffins beneath a soaring golden dome, but not all of him made the trip. Napoleon's missing anatomy is at least accounted for. The next case involves something that vanished from a government archive, and its disappearance has fueled 6 decades of conspiracy theories. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963, a date seared into the memory of every American who was alive to witness it. The 35th president, who had entered office as the youngest elected president in American history, was 46 years old. The motorcade through Dealey Plaza, the shots from the Texas School Book Depository, the frantic race to Parkland Memorial Hospital. These are among the most studied minutes in modern history. Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Central Time. In the chaos that followed, his body was placed in a bronze ceremonial casket and rushed to Air Force One, where Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office with Jacqueline Kennedy standing beside him, still wearing her blood-stained pink suit. An autopsy was performed that evening at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, an autopsy that has been criticized by pathologists ever since as rushed, poorly documented, and compromised by the presence of military admirals and generals in the room who may have influenced the proceedings. During the autopsy, Kennedy's brain was removed and preserved in formalin for further examination, then placed in a stainless steel container and stored with other autopsy materials. By 1966, 3 years later, the brain had vanished from the National Archives. It has never been found. The disappearance fueled decades of conspiracy theories. Some believed the brain was stolen to conceal evidence that Kennedy had been shot from the front, from the so-called grassy knoll, rather than from behind, as the Warren Commission concluded. A brain showing the trajectory of the bullet wounds could have settled the debate definitively. Author James Swanson, who investigated the matter for his book on the assassination, reached a different conclusion. He believes Robert F. Kennedy took the brain. The reason, Swanson suggested, may not have been to hide ballistic evidence, but rather to conceal the full extent of his brother's medical conditions and the numerous medications he was taking, including treatments for Addison's disease and chronic back pain, information the Kennedy family considered deeply private and politically damaging. JFK's former secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, stated in government interviews that the brain and other autopsy materials had been delivered to a representative of Robert Kennedy's in 1965. The truth remains unknown. Kennedy is buried at Arlington National Cemetery beneath an eternal flame that Jacqueline Kennedy requested be lit at his funeral, visited by millions of people each year. But a part of him, a part that could settle some of history's most persistent questions, is simply gone. We've been dealing with presidents and emperors. Time to change the mood entirely, to a story involving a borrowed hearse, 5 gallons of gasoline, and one of the most loyal road managers in the history of rock and roll. Graham Parsons never achieved the fame in life that he deserved. A pioneer of what he called cosmic American music, the blend of rock, country, and soul that we now call alt-country. Parsons was the trust fund kid from Winter Haven, Florida, who fell in love with country music while most of his peers were listening to the Beatles. He attended Harvard briefly before dropping out to pursue music full-time. He played a pivotal role in the making of the Byrds' 1968 album, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, one of the first major attempts to fuse rock and country at a time when the two genres were separated by a deep cultural divide. He and fellow Byrd Chris Hillman co-founded the Flying Burrito Brothers, whose debut album, The Gilded Palace of Sin, released in 1969, is now regarded as one of the most important records in country rock history. Parsons became close friends with Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, and his country influence can be heard on albums like Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main State. He released 2 solo albums, GP and the posthumous Grievous Angel, both featuring exquisite harmonies with a then-unknown singer named Emmylou Harris. Harris would go on to become one of country music's greatest artists, and she has credited Parsons with changing her life and her music. But Parsons struggled with drugs and alcohol throughout his short life, and by 1973, his health and career were both in decline. On September 19, 1973, Parsons died of a morphine and alcohol overdose in Room 8 of the Joshua Tree Inn, a small motel near Joshua Tree National Park in California. He was 26 years old. His stepfather in Louisiana arranged for the body to be shipped home for burial. But Parsons had made a pact with his road manager, Phil Kaufman, just a few months earlier, at the funeral of Byrds guitarist Clarence White. If either of them died, the other would take the body to Joshua Tree, have a few drinks, and burn it in the desert. Kaufman decided to honor the promise. He and a friend, Michael Martin, drove to Los Angeles International Airport in Martin's personal Cadillac hearse, signed for the body using the name Jeremy Nobody, and drove it back to Joshua Tree. At Caprock, a prominent formation in the park, Kaufman poured 5 gallons of gasoline into the open coffin and threw in a match. The resulting fireball was enormous. The 2 men fled when they saw headlights approaching. The partially cremated remains were recovered by police. Since there was no law at the time against stealing a dead body, Kaufman and Martin were charged only with stealing the coffin and fined. Parsons' charred remains were eventually buried at Garden of Memories Cemetery in Metairie, Louisiana, exactly where his stepfather had wanted him in the first place. Caprock has become an unofficial pilgrimage site for fans. The National Park Service periodically removes graffiti and makeshift memorials from the rocks, but they always return. Graham Parsons was scattered across the California desert by a friend who loved him. The next man on our tour was scattered across 2 continents by a stranger who admired him, and what's left of him could be anywhere. Thomas Paine was the man whose pamphlet Common Sense, published in January 1776, lit the fuse of the American Revolution. It sold an estimated 500,000 copies to a population of about 3 million, the equivalent of 100 million copies today. George Washington had it read aloud to his troops. Without Thomas Paine, there might not be a United States of America. And yet, when Paine died in New York City on June 8, 1809, at the age of 72, only 6 people attended his funeral. His later writings attacking organized religion, particularly the Age of Reason, had made him a pariah. He was buried on his small farm in New Rochelle, New York, under a tree. No monument, no fanfare. 10 years later, in 1819, the English journalist William Cobbett, who had once despised Paine but had since become an admirer, traveled to New Rochelle in the middle of the night with hired laborers, dug up Paine's bones, packed them into bags, and smuggled them to New York, then aboard a ship to England. Cobbett's plan was to build a grand memorial to Paine on English soil and use the bones as a rallying point for democratic reform. It didn't work. The British public found the whole thing distasteful. No monument was ever built. Cobbett kept the bones in a trunk in his attic until his death in 1835. After that, the remains entered a world of confusion and competing claims. His son tried to auction them off. A court refused to classify human remains as an asset of the estate, The bones were scattered. Over the following decades, people across England and beyond claimed to possess various parts of Thomas Paine: a rib in France, a jawbone in Brighton, a skull reportedly sold to an Australian businessman in 1988. A mummified brainstem and a lock of hair were reburied under Paine's monument in New Rochelle in 1905, but his complete remains have never been accounted for. The man who wrote the words that helped found a nation has no proper grave anywhere on Earth. Thomas Paine has no grave at all. The next man on our tour has a grave, a famous one, in one of the world's most visited cemeteries. But what's inside it is missing a few important pieces. Ludwig van Beethoven died in Vienna on March 26, 1827, at the age of 56. The cause was liver failure, likely from a combination of cirrhosis and hepatitis B, though the exact factors have been debated for nearly 2 centuries. An estimated 20,000 people attended his funeral. He was buried at Waring Cemetery in Vienna. And then the examinations began. The autopsy, performed the day after his death by Dr. Johann Wagner, was notoriously rough. The top of Beethoven's skull was sawed open to examine his brain, and during the process, his temporal bones, the bones surrounding the inner ear, which researchers desperately wanted to study to understand his famous deafness, were removed and never returned. They have never been found. Hair was clipped from his head by visitors and admirers. The skull was closed up, and he was buried. In 1863, the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, Vienna's foremost musical society, arranged to exhume both Beethoven and Franz Schubert, who was buried nearby for study. During this exhumation, Dr. Romeo Seligman, a professor of medical history who was present, acquired fragments of Beethoven's skull that had broken off during the original autopsy. He took them home. The composer, Anton Bruckner, who attended Beethoven's second exhumation in 1888, when the body was being moved to its current resting place in Vienna's Central Cemetery, reportedly picked up Beethoven's skull and cradled it in his hands. By one account, Bruckner dropped a lens from his pince-nez into the coffin so that a piece of himself would rest with Beethoven forever. The skull fragments passed down through Seligman's family for generations, eventually reaching a California businessman named Paul Kaufmann, who returned them to the Medical University of Vienna in 2023 for further study. Beethoven's body rests in Vienna's Central Cemetery today, but parts of his skull, locks of his hair, and his inner ear bones are spread across multiple countries and institutions. In 2023, DNA analysis of authenticated hair samples confirmed that Beethoven had hepatitis B and a genetic predisposition to liver disease, answers his own autopsy, nearly 200 years earlier, had failed to provide. Beethoven's bones ended up in labs, but sometimes a body gets dug up not for science, but to prove who's actually in the coffin. And few cases have generated more doubt than the most famous outlaw in American history. Jesse James was the most famous outlaw in American history, a bank robber, train robber, and folk hero whose exploits captivated the nation during the 1870s and whose legend grew far beyond the facts of his life. With his brother Frank, James led a gang that robbed banks, stagecoaches, and trains across the Midwest for more than 15 years, always managing to slip away. Newspapers couldn't get enough of him. Dime novels turned him into a Robin Hood figure, a former Confederate guerrilla fighting back against the railroads and the banks that were squeezing ordinary farmers. Whether he ever gave a cent to the poor is highly debatable, but the myth was irresistible. On April 3, 1882, James was shot and killed in his own home in St. Joseph, Missouri, by Robert Ford, a member of his own gang who wanted the $10,000 reward money. James was just 34. Ford, far from being celebrated, was reviled as a coward. The dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard, as the folk song put it, using the alias James had been living under. James was buried on the family farm in Kearney, Missouri, and the story should have ended there. But it didn't, because almost immediately people started doubting the story. Rumors circulated that James had faked his own death and that Ford had actually killed someone else, a convenient stand-in who took the bullet while the real Jesse disappeared into the frontier. Over the decades, more than 24 men came forward claiming to be Jesse James. The most persistent was J. Frank Dalton, a 100-year-old man who surfaced in 1948 with a detailed and mostly unprovable story. The claim was widely reported and widely doubted. In 1995, at the request of the James family, Jesse's body was exhumed from the Kearney Cemetery and subjected to DNA testing. The results confirmed that the remains were indeed those of Jesse James, matching DNA from known descendants. The conspiracy theory was laid to rest, though some die-hard believers remained unconvinced and even pushed for the exhumation of Dalton's body in 2000, hoping to prove he was the real Jesse. That effort produced no definitive results. Jesse James, the real one, is back in his grave in Kearney, Missouri, where fans still visit. Jesse James was dug up to prove he was Jesse James. The next man was dug up to prove he wasn't a Soviet spy. His story is even stranger. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man identified by the Warren Commission as the lone assassin of President Kennedy, was himself shot and killed just 2 days after the assassination, on November 24, 1963, by Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Oswald was buried at Rose Hill Burial Park in Fort Worth in a funeral so sparsely attended that reporters were asked to serve as pallbearers. In 1975, British author Michael Edowis published a book claiming that the man buried in Oswald's grave was not Oswald at all, but a Soviet spy who had been substituted for the real Oswald during his defection to the Soviet Union in 1959. Edowis's evidence was largely circumstantial. He pointed out discrepancies in Oswald's listed height before and after his time in Russia. But the theory gained enough traction that Oswald's widow, Marina Oswald Porter, eventually agreed to allow the exhumation. On October 4, 1981, in extreme secrecy, workers opened the grave at 5 a.m. The concrete vault had cracked and water had seeped into the coffin, reducing the body to skeletal remains. The remains were driven to Baylor Medical Center in Dallas, where a team of forensic pathologists spent over 4 hours comparing the teeth to Oswald's Marine Corps dental records. The conclusion was definitive. It was Oswald. The rings Marina had placed on his fingers before burial were still there. He was reburied in a new coffin. Years later, the original pine coffin was put up for auction by a funeral home, sparking a lawsuit from Oswald's brother Robert. A judge ruled the funeral home had no right to sell it. Enough conspiracies. Let's talk about Hollywood glamour and a burial plot that has generated more drama than most of the movies made by the woman who rests there. Marilyn Monroe, born Norma Jean Mortensen, raised in foster homes and orphanages, and transformed into the most iconic movie star of the 20th century, died on August 4, 1962, at the age of 36, from an overdose of barbiturates at her home in Brentwood, Los Angeles. She had starred in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Some Like It Hot, The 7-Year Itch, and a string of other films that made her the defining sex symbol of the 1950s, though she longed to be taken seriously as an actress and studied at the Actors Studio in New York under Lee Strasberg. Her personal life was turbulent. 2 brief marriages to baseball legend Joe DiMaggio and playwright Arthur Miller, and rumored relationships with both John and Robert Kennedy. DiMaggio, who had never stopped loving her, arranged a private funeral, pointedly excluding Hollywood friends and the Kennedys. He chose to inter her at Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park, a small, discreet cemetery tucked behind a movie theater in Westwood, far from the spectacle of Hollywood Forever or Forest Lawn. DiMaggio chose it because 2 women who had helped care for Marilyn as a child were already buried there. For the next 20 years, until his own death in 1999, DiMaggio had a dozen red roses delivered to her crypt twice a week, but Marilyn's eternal rest has been anything but peaceful. In 1992, Playboy founder Hugh Hefner purchased the crypt directly to the left of hers for $75,000. Monroe had been the cover model and centerfold of the first issue of Playboy in December 1953, though she had never met Hefner and had no say in the use of her photographs. The pictures had been taken years earlier for a calendar shoot when she was a struggling model, and Hefner had simply bought the rights. Hefner was interred in the crypt when he died in 2017 at age 91. The crypt directly above Marilyn's has its own story. It was reportedly purchased by a Los Angeles entrepreneur named Richard Poncher, who had acquired it from DiMaggio during the baseball player's 1954 divorce from Monroe. When Poncher died in 1986, his wife Elsie claimed that he had asked to be buried face down above Marilyn. In 2009, facing financial difficulties, Elsie put the crypt up for auction on eBay with a starting bid of $500,000. A Japanese bidder reportedly offered more than $4 million, though it's unclear whether the sale was ever completed. Other crypts near Marilyn's have been listed for sale at prices in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. In death as in life, everyone wants to be close to Marilyn Monroe. The question is whether Marilyn would have wanted any of them close to her. Marilyn never got any peace. Neither did the next man on our tour, though he probably would have enjoyed the absurdity of the reason they dug him up. Salvador Dalí, the Spanish surrealist painter famous for melting clocks, lobster telephones, and a self-promotional genius that rivaled his artistic genius, died on January 23, 1989, at the age of 84. In his final years, Dalí had become increasingly reclusive, living alone in a tower of his museum in Figueres after the death of his wife and muse, Gala. He was buried in a crypt beneath the stage of the Dalí Theater Museum in Figueres, Spain, a museum he had designed himself, converting an old municipal theater into an immersive surrealist experience that is essentially his greatest work of art. He had no children and left his entire estate, including his art collection, to the Spanish state. 28 years later, in 2017, a Spanish woman named Pilar Abel came forward claiming that Dalí was her biological father, that her mother had had an affair with the artist in the port town of Cadaqués in the mid-1950s. Abel had been pursuing her paternity claim for years, and a Madrid court finally ordered Dalí's body exhumed for DNA comparison. On the night of July 20th, 2017, forensic specialists opened the crypt in a procedure that was kept secret from the public and the press. They extracted hair, nail, and bone samples. They also made a discovery that delighted the world when it was announced. After nearly 3 decades in the grave, Dalí's iconic upturned mustache was perfectly intact, still in its trademark 10 past 10 position. The lead forensic examiner reportedly said it was his most surreal professional experience, which seems fitting for the man who once arrived at a lecture in a Rolls-Royce filled with cauliflower. The DNA results came back several months later. Dalí was not Abel's father. The Dalí Foundation, which had fought to prevent the exhumation and stood to lose a share of the estate if paternity were established, was vindicated. Dalí's body was returned to his crypt in the Theater Museum, where he remains today, beneath the stage where he once performed, surrounded by his own art. The mustache, apparently, is eternal. Dalí spent 28 years underground before his mustache made headlines. The next man on our tour has been dead for over 5 centuries, and 2 countries are still arguing over which one actually has him. Christopher Columbus, the Genoese navigator whose 1492 voyage across the Atlantic on behalf of the Spanish crown changed the course of world history, died on May 20th, 1506, in Valladolid, Spain, at the age of about 54. He had crossed the Atlantic 4 times and opened the Americas to European exploration, though he went to his grave believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia. In his final years, Columbus was stripped of his titles and governorship, bitter about what he saw as Spain's ingratitude. He wanted to be buried in the Americas, the lands he had claimed for Spain. Instead, he was initially buried in Valladolid, then moved to a monastery in Seville. In 1537, at his daughter-in-law's request, his remains were shipped across the Atlantic to the cathedral in Santo Domingo, in what is now the Dominican Republic, finally reaching the New World, as he had wished. When France took control of the island's eastern half in 1795, Spain, not wanting to leave Columbus in French territory, dug up what they believed were his remains and moved them to Havana, Cuba. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, when Spain lost Cuba, the remains were shipped back across the Atlantic to the Cathedral of Seville, where they now rest in an elaborate tomb held aloft by 4 bronze figures representing the historical kingdoms of Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Navarra. But there's a problem. In 1877, workers in the Santo Domingo Cathedral found a lead box inscribed with Columbus's name that still contained bone fragments. The Dominican Republic has long claimed that Spain dug up the wrong body in 1795 and that the real Columbus never left the island. The remains in Santo Domingo are now housed in an elaborate lighthouse-shaped mausoleum, the Faro a Colón. DNA testing of the Seville remains, conducted between 2003 and 2006, confirmed that they do contain Columbus's bones. They matched DNA from his son Diego and his brother Bartholomew. But the Dominican Republic has refused to allow testing of its remains. The current scientific consensus is that Columbus's bones are probably in both places, that when the Spanish exhumed remains in 1795, they may have taken only part of the skeleton, leaving some behind. Columbus, the great explorer, continues to occupy 2 graves on 2 continents, a fitting afterlife for a man who spent his life crossing the ocean between them. Columbus is split between 2 continents. The next man on our tour was split between his own body and his head, and it took 145 years to put him back together. Joseph Haydn, the Austrian composer known as the father of the symphony and the father of the string quartet, died in Vienna on May 31, 1809, at the age of 77. He was one of the most celebrated musicians in Europe. But Napoleon's armies had just occupied Vienna, and in the chaos of war, Haydn was buried quickly and without the grand ceremony his status warranted. Shortly after the burial, 2 acquaintances, a prison administrator named Johann Nepomuk Peter and a phrenologist named Karl Rosenbaum, bribed a gravedigger to let them remove Haydn's head. They wanted to study his skull according to the principles of phrenology, the now discredited science of reading personality from the bumps on a person's skull. When Haydn's patron, Prince Nicholas Esterhazy, ordered the body exhumed in 1820 to move it to a more prestigious location, the missing head was discovered. Rosenbaum was confronted. He offered a substitute skull and then another substitute skull, but refused to hand over the real one. The headless body was moved to Eisenstadt, Austria, where Haydn had spent much of his career. Haydn's skull passed through several owners over the next century, eventually ending up at the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in Vienna. It wasn't until 1954, 145 years after Haydn's death, that his skull was finally reunited with the rest of his body in the Bergkirche in Eisenstadt. His tomb now contains 2 skulls, the real one and the substitute that was placed there in 1820, which was never removed. No one is quite sure whose skull that second one is. Haydn's tomb now has 2 skulls and nobody knows whose the spare one is. Our next skull mystery involves the most famous writer in the English language, and a 400-year-old curse that apparently wasn't enough to stop the thieves. William Shakespeare, the playwright behind Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and at least 34 other works that have shaped the English language more profoundly than anything else ever written, died on April 23, 1616, at the age of 52, in his hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon. The cause of death was not recorded. He was buried inside Holy Trinity Church, a medieval parish church on the banks of the River Avon, where his grave is marked with a famous curse carved in stone. "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Whether Shakespeare wrote the inscription himself is debated, but the warning is clear. The threat apparently worked for nearly 2 centuries. But in the 1790s, according to local legend, a group of grave robbers opened the tomb and stole Shakespeare's skull. One persistent account names a Dr. Frank Chambers as having paid some men to steal it in 1794. This remained folklore until 2016, when archaeologists used ground-penetrating radar to scan Shakespeare's grave without disturbing it. The curse apparently still carrying enough weight that no one wanted to physically open the tomb. The scans revealed something unusual. The area where the skull should be appeared to have been disturbed at some point in the past, and the skull did appear to be missing. The head end of the grave showed signs of having been opened and refilled. The rest of the skeleton appeared to be intact and undisturbed. The discovery, announced shortly before the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, lent credibility to the old legend. Shakespeare's body, minus, apparently, its most important part, remains in Holy Trinity Church, still protected by that 400-year-old curse. Where the skull ended up, no one knows. It has never surfaced in any collection, museum, or private holding. A skull in a church in Beoley, Worcestershire, was once proposed as Shakespeare's, but testing proved inconclusive. Shakespeare's skull vanished and no one knows where it went. The next story involves the opposite problem, a body part that someone grabbed out of a fire and refused to give back. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the Romantic poet who wrote Ozymandias and Ode to the West Wind, and whose lyrical genius placed him among the greatest English poets, drowned on July 8, 1822, when his sailboat, the Don Juan, sank in a sudden storm in the Gulf of Spezia off the coast of Italy. He was 29 years old, the same age, as it happened, as his friend John Keats had been when Keats died in Rome the previous year. Shelley had been sailing from Livorno back to his home in Larizzi. His body washed ashore 10 days later near Viareggio, identifiable mainly by the volume of Keats's poetry in his jacket pocket. Italian quarantine regulations, put in place to prevent the spread of disease, required that the body be burned on the beach rather than transported. So Shelley's friends, the poet Lord Byron, the writer Leigh Hunt, and the adventurer Edward John Trelawney, organized a cremation on the sand, pouring wine, oil, and salt on the pyre in imitation of ancient Greek funeral rites. During the burning, according to Trelawney's vivid account, the heart refused to burn. Trelawney reached into the flames and snatched it out, severely burning his hand in the process. There was a bitter tug-of-war between Trelawney and Leigh Hunt over who should keep the heart, eventually settled by Mary Shelley's insistence. The heart went to Shelley's widow, Mary, the author of Frankenstein. Mary Shelley kept the heart, wrapped in a page from one of his last poems, in her writing desk for the rest of her life, nearly 30 years. When she died in 1851, her son and daughter-in-law found it there, preserved in a silken shroud. Whether it was truly a heart is debated by medical historians. Some believe it may have been a calcified mass of tissue that resisted the flames, possibly the result of earlier tuberculosis, which can leave calcium deposits in the pericardium. But Mary believed it was his heart, and that's what mattered to her. It was buried with her son, Percy Florence Shelley, in 1889 at St. Peter's Church in Boscombe, England. The rest of Shelley's ashes were interred in the Protestant cemetery in Rome, near the grave of his friend Keats, two romantic poets, dead young, resting near each other in a foreign country far from the England they both loved. Shelley's heart was kept in a desk drawer for 30 years. Our next story is less romantic but no less dramatic. A sitting president dug up 140 years after his death to find out if he was murdered. Zachary Taylor, the 12th President of the United States, was a career military officer. Old Rough and Ready, his troops called him, who had never held elected office before winning the presidency in 1848 on the strength of his heroism in the Mexican-American War. He died suddenly on July 9, 1850, just 16 months into his presidency. He had attended 4th of July celebrations at the partly built Washington Monument on a blazing hot day, where he reportedly consumed large quantities of raw cherries and cold milk. He fell ill with severe gastroenteritis within hours and died 5 days later, at the age of 65. He was the second sitting president to die in office, after William Henry Harrison. For more than a century, this was accepted as the cause of death, a tragic case of food poisoning. But in the 1980s, a historian named Clara Rising became convinced that Taylor had been murdered by arsenic poisoning, possibly by pro-slavery politicians who opposed his stance against expanding slavery into the Western territories. Taylor, a slaveholder himself, had surprised many by taking a moderate position on the question, and some historians have speculated that his death conveniently removed an obstacle to the Compromise of 1850. Rising spent years building her case. She noted that arsenic was widely available in the 1850s, that the symptoms of arsenic poisoning can mimic gastroenteritis, and that Taylor's sudden decline after a public event was consistent with a poisoning scenario. She also pointed out that Taylor's vice president, Millard Fillmore, reversed nearly all of Taylor's policies within weeks of taking office, which, to conspiracy-minded historians, looked awfully convenient. Rising persuaded Taylor's descendants to authorize an exhumation. On June 17, 1991, Taylor became the first president to have his remains exhumed for forensic testing. His body was removed from its tomb at Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky, and samples of hair, fingernails, and tissue were analyzed by the Kentucky Chief Medical Examiner using neutron activation analysis. The results were conclusive. Taylor was not poisoned. Arsenic levels in his remains were hundreds of times lower than would be expected in an arsenic poisoning case. He almost certainly died of acute gastroenteritis, exactly as the doctors had said in 1850. His remains were returned to his tomb the same day. Clara Rising, to her credit, accepted the findings publicly, though she later said she didn't regret the investigation. The question, she felt, had deserved an answer. Taylor was dug up, tested, and put right back. The next body on our tour has never been put back, because it was never buried in the first place. Vladimir Lenin, the revolutionary leader who founded the Soviet Union and led the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, died on January 21, 1924, at the age of 53, after suffering a series of debilitating strokes that had left him increasingly incapacitated. His wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, pleaded with the Communist Party leadership to give him a simple burial, in keeping with his wishes. But Joseph Stalin and the Politburo had other plans. They decided to preserve Lenin's body and put it on permanent public display, turning the father of the revolution into a secular saint. An object of veneration for the Soviet state, his embalmed corpse was placed in a specially designed mausoleum in Red Square, Moscow, a stark, angular structure of red granite and black labradorite, where it has remained ever since, now over 100 years. Keeping Lenin looking presentable has been an extraordinary scientific undertaking. A dedicated laboratory, originally known as the Lenin Lab, was established solely for this purpose. His body is regularly treated with chemical solutions, including formaldehyde and glycerol, and is periodically immersed in a bath of these chemicals for weeks at a time to maintain tissue flexibility and color. The temperature and humidity inside the glass sarcophagus are precisely controlled. His suit is replaced every few years. Over the decades, parts of his skin have been replaced with artificial materials where deterioration occurred. Despite all this effort, the question of whether Lenin should finally be buried has been debated in Russia for decades. Boris Yeltsin publicly supported burial. Vladimir Putin has called the display a tradition that should not be disrupted. The Russian Orthodox Church has repeatedly called for a Christian burial. Polls have consistently shown that a majority of Russians favor burying him. But the body remains on display, visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year who file past in enforced silence. One of the world's most unusual resting places, if you can call it resting. The man who joined Lenin in that mausoleum had an even stranger posthumous fate. Joseph Stalin, who ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist from the late 1920s until his death in 1953, was responsible for the industrialization of Russia, the defeat of Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, and the deaths of millions of his own citizens through purges, forced collectivization, and the Gulag labor camp system. He died on March 5, 1953, at the age of 74, after suffering a massive stroke at his country dacha. His inner circle, terrified of him even in death, reportedly delayed calling a doctor for hours. Stalin was embalmed and placed alongside Lenin in the Red Square Mausoleum, where the two Soviet leaders lay side by side for 8 years, receiving a procession of visitors from around the communist world. But in 1961, as part of Nikita Khrushchev's campaign of de-Stalinization, which involved revealing the full extent of Stalin's purges, show trials, and mass executions to an astonished Soviet public, the government decided that Stalin no longer deserved the honor of lying beside Lenin. his body was quietly removed from the mausoleum on the night of October 31st, 1961, Halloween, though the Soviets did not observe the holiday, and reburied in a simple grave behind the mausoleum, against the Kremlin wall. Concrete was poured over the coffin to prevent any attempt to retrieve the body. The grave was initially unmarked. A modest bust was later placed there, and it remains Stalin's burial site today, a humble spot compared to the grand display he once occupied, just steps from the man whose revolution he hijacked and the wall behind which so many of his decisions were made. Stalin was evicted from the mausoleum and buried under concrete. Meanwhile, halfway across Europe, another famous man lay hidden for centuries, not because anyone had moved him, but because everyone had simply forgotten where they put him. Nicolaus Copernicus, the Renaissance astronomer who formulated the heliocentric model, the revolutionary idea that the Earth and other planets revolve around the Sun, rather than everything revolving around the Earth, died on May 24, 1543, at the age of 70. Legend has it that a copy of his landmark book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, was placed in his hands on his deathbed. The book would transform humanity's understanding of the cosmos, though its full impact would not be felt for generations. Galileo, whose story we heard earlier, would be persecuted by the Church for championing Copernicus's ideas nearly a century later. Copernicus was buried at Frombork Cathedral in northern Poland, where he had served as a canon of the Catholic Church. Astronomy was essentially his hobby, practiced in the hours between his clerical duties. But despite his growing fame over the following centuries, his grave was never properly marked, and within a few generations, no one knew exactly where in the cathedral he was buried. For over 2 centuries, archaeologists and historians searched the cathedral without success, excavating beneath the stone floors without finding him. The breakthrough came in 2005, when a team of Polish researchers led by archaeologist Jerzy Gosowski used ground-penetrating radar beneath the floor of the cathedral and found human remains in a spot consistent with where a canon of Copernicus's rank would have been buried, near the altar he was responsible for tending. The skull was reconstructed using forensic facial reconstruction techniques, producing a face that bore a remarkable resemblance to known portraits of Copernicus, right down to a broken nose and the marks of a scar above the left eye. In 2008, DNA extracted from the bones was compared with hairs found pressed between the pages of a calendar and astronomical reference book that Copernicus was known to have owned and used throughout his life, now held in a Swedish library. The DNA matched. The man who moved the Earth from the center of the universe had been lying under the floor of his own cathedral all along. He was reburied there with full honors on May 22, 2010, 467 years after his death, in a ceremony attended by the Polish president and Catholic bishops. Copernicus lay under his own cathedral floor all along. The next story is murkier. A theft that may or may not have happened, involving a secret society, a future president's father, and the skull of one of the most feared warriors in American history. Geronimo, the legendary Apache leader whose name became a battle cry for generations of American soldiers, and whose fierce resistance to the United States and Mexican governments made him one of the most famous Native Americans in history, died of pneumonia on February 17, 1909, at the age of 79, at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He had been held as a prisoner of war for over 20 years, ever since his final surrender in 1886 in the mountains of Arizona. In his later years, he had become something of a celebrity, appearing at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis and riding in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905. He was buried at the Apache Prisoner of War Cemetery at Fort Sill. 9 years later, in 1918, a group of young Army officers stationed at Fort Sill and affiliated with Yale University's Skull and Bones Secret Society allegedly dug up Geronimo's grave and stole his skull and 2 femur bones. They supposedly brought the skull to the Skull and Bones headquarters known as the Tomb on the Yale campus in New Haven, Connecticut, where it was said to be displayed in a glass case alongside other macabre trophies. The society has adamantly denied the story for over a century. But in 2006, historian Mark Wortman discovered a 1918 letter between two Skull and Bones members that referenced having obtained the skull of the worthy Geronimo the Terrible, exhumed from his tomb at Fort Sill. One of the men named in connection with the alleged theft was Prescott Bush, the father of President George H.W. Bush and grandfather of President George W. Bush. In 2009, Geronimo's descendants filed a federal lawsuit seeking the return of his remains. The case was dismissed on procedural grounds. Whether or not Geronimo's skull is really sitting in a glass case at Yale, the story itself has become part of his legend, a final indignity in a life full of them, or an urban myth that perfectly captures the relationship between power and the powerless in American history. Geronimo's skull may or may not sit in a glass case at Yale. The next man's body was examined and re-examined to make sure it was really him, and given what he did, you can understand why people had doubts. John Wilkes Booth, the actor who assassinated Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater, was cornered in a tobacco barn in Virginia 12 days after the shooting, and was either shot by a Union soldier named Boston Corbett, or shot himself. Accounts differ, and the chaos of the moment makes a definitive answer impossible. He died on April 26, 1865, at the age of 26. We open this documentary with Lincoln, and here we meet his killer, a man whose body was treated with almost as much suspicion as Lincoln's was treated with reverence. Booth's body was brought back to Washington under heavy guard, where it was secretly buried beneath the floor of the old penitentiary at the Washington Arsenal. The government wanted no grave for sympathizers to visit, no shrine for would-be martyrs. In 1867, the body was exhumed and identified, then moved to a storage room in a warehouse at the Arsenal. In 1869, at the persistent request of the Booth family, the remains were finally released and buried in an unmarked grave in the family plot at Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore. But doubts about whether the man killed in the barn was really Booth persisted for decades. A lawyer named Finis Bates claimed in 1907 that the real Booth had lived on under the name John St. Helen and had confessed his identity before dying in 1903. St. Helen's mummified corpse was even taken on a national tour as the man who shot Lincoln, displayed in carnivals and sideshows across America, eventually ending up in a Philadelphia garage before disappearing entirely. To settle the question once and for all, descendants sought permission to exhume Booth's brother Edwin, the famous Shakespearean actor, from his grave in Boston to compare DNA. The museum holding autopsy vertebrae from John Wilkes Booth's body also agreed to participate. However, as of this writing, the testing has never been conclusively carried out, and the conspiracy theories, much weakened but not entirely dead, persist. Booth's grave in Baltimore remains unmarked, and the Booth family prefers it that way. Booth's grave in Baltimore remains unmarked to this day. The next man's grave is anything but unmarked. There are actually two of them in two different states, and both insist they have the real bones. Daniel Boone, the legendary pioneer and explorer who blazed the wilderness road through the Cumberland Gap and helped settle Kentucky in the 1770s, opening the Trans-Appalachian frontier to thousands of settlers, died on September 26, 1820, at the age of 85, near present-day Marthasville, Missouri. He had left Kentucky decades earlier, frustrated by land disputes and lawsuits that had cost him nearly all the land he had claimed, and moved to what was then Spanish-held Missouri, where the Spanish government granted him a large tract of land. He was buried in an unmarked grave on a bluff above the Missouri River, next to his wife Rebecca, who had died 7 years earlier. In 1845, 25 years after his death, the state of Kentucky, which claimed Boone as its greatest son, sent a delegation to Missouri to exhume the remains and bring them to a more prestigious burial site in Frankfort, the state capital. The reburial was meant to be a grand occasion honoring the man who had opened the West. Missouri cooperated, but grudgingly, and almost immediately, Missourians began claiming that the Kentuckians had dug up the wrong body. An enslaved man who had originally helped dig Boone's grave reportedly told the exhumation party that they were digging in the wrong spot. There are also accounts suggesting that the hillside where Boone was buried had been used for multiple burials, and the remains may have been confused. A local tradition holds that Boone's family, forewarned of the Kentucky delegation's visit, quietly moved the real remains to prevent them from being taken. Both states now claim to hold Daniel Boone's actual bones, Kentucky in the Frankfort Cemetery, under a monument that draws visitors from around the world, and Missouri in the original gravesite on the bluff. No DNA testing has ever been conducted, and both states seem content to maintain their claims without settling the question. Daniel Boone spent his life on the frontier between the known and the unknown. In death, he remains there. Daniel Boone is claimed by 2 states, and neither will back down. The next story takes us to a quiet German cemetery, where the director of cinema's first great horror film suffered a fate that could have come straight from one of his screenplays. F.W. Murnau directed Nosferatu, the 1922 silent horror classic that introduced the world to the vampire Count Orlok, with his bald head, pointed ears, and elongated fingers, and became one of the most influential horror films ever made, spawning an entire genre of vampire cinema. Born Friedrich Wilhelm Plumpe in Bielefeld, Germany in 1888, Murnau had studied art history under the great Max Reinhardt before turning to filmmaking. He moved to Hollywood in the late 1920s at the height of his artistic powers and directed several acclaimed films, including Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, a masterpiece of visual storytelling that won 3 Academy Awards at the very first ceremony in 1929, including what was then called the Award for Unique and Artistic Production. He died in a car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway on March 11, 1931, at the age of 42, just days before the premiere of his final film, Taboo. His Filipino valet, Garcia Stevenson, was driving. Murnau was embalmed and his remains were shipped back to Germany, where he was buried in the family plot at Stahnsdorf Southwestern Cemetery near Berlin, one of the largest woodland cemeteries in Europe. For decades, the grave was left in peace, a modest family plot in a sprawling woodland cemetery, visited mainly by film scholars and horror enthusiasts who made the pilgrimage to pay respects to the man who had defined an entire genre. Then, in July 2015, the grave was broken into, and Murnau's skull was stolen. The director of Nosferatu, the man who gave the world its most famous cinematic vampire, had his head taken from his grave. Police found wax residue at the scene, suggesting the use of candles, which led to widespread speculation about an occult ritual. The cemetery had been the target of vandalism before, but nothing on this scale. Despite an extensive investigation, the skull has never been recovered, and no one has been charged with the crime. The rest of Murnau's remains are still in Stahnsdorf, and his family has added additional security to the gravesite. The irony that the creator of cinema's greatest horror films suffered a posthumous violation that sounds like a scene from a horror film has not been lost on anyone. If Murnau were alive to direct it, he'd probably appreciate the atmosphere, though he might have preferred a different ending. Murnau's skull has never been found. The next composer on our tour faces a different problem. It's not that his skull was stolen, but that a skull claiming to be his has been floating around for 2 centuries, and nobody can prove it's real. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the child prodigy who performed before European royalty at the age of 6, the composer of The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, The Magic Flute, and over 600 other works that remain at the pinnacle of Western music, died on December 5, 1791, at the age of 35, in Vienna. He had been working feverishly on his Requiem, a mass for the dead commissioned by a mysterious stranger, and was too ill to complete it. The circumstances of his death have been debated for over 2 centuries. Theories range from rheumatic fever to kidney disease to poisoning by his rival Antonio Salieri, though that last theory, popularized by the film Amadeus, has been largely discredited by modern scholars. Mozart was buried in St. Mark's Cemetery in Vienna, in a common grave. Not a pauper's grave, as is sometimes said, but a standard burial for a middle-class citizen of Vienna at the time, in which multiple bodies were buried in the same plot, and the graves were reused after a set number of years. His wife Constanze, who was ill herself at the time of his death, did not attend the funeral and reportedly did not visit the grave for years. No one recorded the exact location of his burial within the cemetery. About a decade after his death, a gravedigger named Joseph Rothmeyer reportedly identified what he believed was Mozart's skull and set it aside before the grave was due to be reused. The skull passed through several hands over the following decades before eventually finding its way to the Mozarteum Foundation in Salzburg, where it resides today. But its authenticity has never been conclusively proven. DNA testing conducted in 2006 compared the skull's genetic material with samples from the remains of Mozart's grandmother and his niece. But the results were inconclusive, in part because the comparison DNA from the relatives was itself uncertain. Their graves, too, had been disturbed over the centuries. The Mozarteum keeps the skull in storage, but does not display it publicly. Mozart's actual gravesite in St. Mark's Cemetery is marked by a memorial monument featuring a mourning angel, but it's a tribute rather than a confirmed burial spot. The greatest musical genius of his century, perhaps of any century, lies somewhere in that Vienna cemetery, but exactly where, no one can say. Mozart's exact resting place remains unknown. The next body on our tour had no such anonymity. It was strung up for all of Milan to see, and the indignities didn't stop there. Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator who ruled Italy from 1922 to 1943, was executed by Italian partisan fighters on April 28, 1945, along with his mistress Clara Petacci as they attempted to flee to Switzerland in the closing days of the Second World War. Their bodies were brought to Milan and hung upside down from the roof of an Esso gas station in the Piazzale Loreto, where crowds kicked, spat upon, and beat the corpses. The same square had been the site of a public execution of 15 anti-fascist partisans the previous year. The location was chosen deliberately. Mussolini was 61 when he died. After the public display, his body was buried in an unmarked grave in Milan's Musocco Cemetery. In April 1946, almost exactly a year after his death, fascist sympathizers led by Domenico Lecisi dug up the body and stole it. For months, the corpse was hidden in various locations, a convent, a trunk, a cupboard, while police searched for it. It was eventually recovered and hidden by the Italian government in a Capuchin monastery near Milan for 11 years, where Franciscan monks watched over it. In 1957, Mussolini's remains were finally returned to his family and buried in the family crypt in Predappio, his hometown. The crypt became, and remains, a pilgrimage site for Italian neo-fascists, something that has caused considerable controversy. During the original autopsy, part of Mussolini's brain was reportedly removed and sent to the United States for study. Not all of it was returned to his widow. In 2009, his granddaughter Alessandra Mussolini, a member of the European Parliament, reported that someone was selling what they claimed were pieces of her grandfather's brain on eBay. The listing was removed. eBay prohibits the sale of human body parts. But the episode illustrated just how thoroughly Mussolini's remains had been scattered and commodified. Mussolini's brain ended up on eBay. The next case is less sensational but arguably more disturbing, because it was done for nothing more than money by people who didn't care whose bones they were stealing. Alistair Cooke was, for decades, one of the most familiar voices on American television and radio. As the host of PBS's Masterpiece Theater from 1971 to 1992, introducing each episode from a wing chair beside a crackling fire with an urbane and reassuring manner that seemed to embody the best of Anglo-American culture, he became a beloved presence in millions of American living rooms. Born in Salford, England in 1908, Cooke had moved to the United States in the 1930s and become an American citizen. He also hosted the BBC radio program Letter from America for an astonishing 58 consecutive years, from 1946 to 2004, making it one of the longest-running one-man broadcasts in the history of radio. He died on March 30, 2004, at the age of 95. Lung cancer had spread to his bones. His body was cremated, or so his family believed. What they didn't know was that before the cremation, his bones had been stolen. A criminal ring operating out of New York had been stealing body parts from recently deceased people at funeral homes across the city and selling them to biomedical companies for use in dental implants, orthopedic surgery, and other medical procedures. The operation was industrial in scale. Investigators estimated that over 1,000 bodies had been plundered over a period of years. The ring, led by a former dental surgeon named Michael Mastromarino, had forged consent forms and falsified medical records, sometimes altering the age and cause of death to make the tissue appear more marketable. Cooke's bones were particularly egregious because the thieves falsified his records to show that he was 85 rather than 95, and that he had not had cancer, when in fact his bones were riddled with the disease. This meant that contaminated bone tissue was potentially implanted into unsuspecting patients across the country. The theft was discovered in 2005, and Mastromarino was sentenced to 18 to 54 years in prison. He died behind bars in 2013. Cooke's family was notified and expressed quiet horror. The man who had spent a lifetime bringing civility and warmth into American living rooms had, in death, become a commodity, stripped for parts like a car in a chop shop. It remains one of the most unsettling cases of body theft in modern history, not because of celebrity worship or political revenge, but because of simple, cold-blooded profit. Cooke's bones were stolen and sold for dental implants. The next man on our tour lost a body part in a much older way, on the battlefield, and it got its own separate burial, its own grave marker, and its own place in history. Thomas Stonewall Jackson was one of the most gifted Confederate generals of the Civil War. Robert E. Lee's right hand, a master of the flanking maneuver, and a deeply eccentric man who sucked on lemons during battle, stood with one arm raised for extended periods because he believed it improved his blood flow and was a devout Presbyterian who prayed before, during, and after combat. Lee once said of him, "I have lost my right arm." On the evening of May 2nd, 1863, at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia, one of the Confederacy's greatest tactical victories, Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men while returning from a scouting mission in the twilight. A volley from a North Carolina regiment struck him 3 times, shattering his left arm. His left arm was amputated the next day in a field hospital by Dr. Hunter McGuire. The arm was buried separately in a small cemetery near the field hospital at Elwood Manor in the Virginia wilderness. Confederate chaplain Beverly Tucker Lacey, a friend of Jackson's, arranged the burial and reportedly said a prayer over the limb. The rest of Jackson died 8 days later, on May 10, 1863, at the age of 39, from complications including pneumonia. His last words were reportedly, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." He was buried at what is now the Stonewall Jackson Memorial Cemetery in Lexington, Virginia, where he had taught at the Virginia Military Institute before the war. The arm remains at Elwood Manor, marked with a small stone. So Stonewall Jackson has 2 graves, one for his arm in the wilderness and one for the rest of him in Lexington, about 150 miles apart. The arm site, now part of the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, is one of the more unusual stops on any Civil War battlefield tour, and proof that in the American Civil War, even body parts got their own memorials. Stonewall Jackson has 2 graves 150 miles apart. The next person on our tour had no grave at all, at least not one anyone could find. For 500 years, a king of England lay under what turned out to be a parking lot. King Richard III, the last Plantagenet king of England and the last English king to die in battle, was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, at the age of 32. Richard had seized the throne from his young nephew Edward V just 2 years earlier. The nephews, the famous princes in the Tower, disappeared under mysterious circumstances and are widely believed to have been murdered on Richard's orders, though this has never been proven. At Bosworth, Richard led a desperate cavalry charge directly at his rival, Henry Tudor, and was cut down in the fighting. According to historical accounts, his body was stripped naked, thrown across a horse, and brought to Leicester, where it was displayed publicly for 2 days before being buried in the Church of the Grey Friars. Over the centuries, the monastery was dissolved during the English Reformation, the church was demolished, and the exact location of Richard's grave was forgotten. Shakespeare's famous portrayal of Richard as a scheming hunchback ensured his villainous reputation, but his grave itself was simply lost. For more than 500 years, no one knew where he was. In 2012, a team from the University of Leicester, working with the Richard III Society, an organization dedicated to rehabilitating the king's reputation, began excavating a parking lot that had been built over the site of the old Grey Friars Church. On the very first day of digging, they found human remains. The skeleton showed severe scoliosis of the spine, consistent with historical descriptions of Richard's physical appearance, and traumatic injuries to the skull consistent with death in battle, including a blow from a bladed weapon that had sliced away a portion of the back of the skull. DNA extracted from the bones was compared with 2 living descendants of Richard's sister Anne of York, and the results confirmed the identification. The last medieval English king had been lying under a parking lot, under a spot that had been painted with the letter R to indicate a reserved parking space. The coincidence was almost too perfect. Richard was reinterred with full ceremony at Leicester Cathedral on March 26, 2015, 530 years after his death. The reburial ceremony was attended by the Archbishop of Canterbury, broadcast live by the BBC, and watched by millions on television. The city of York had argued fiercely that Richard, who had strong northern connections and had used York as his power base, should have been buried in York Minster, but a court ruled that Leicester had the stronger claim. Richard III now lies in a dignified tomb in Leicester Cathedral, finally at rest after half a millennium under a parking lot. Richard III was found under a parking space marked with the letter R. The next man on our tour had no such mystery about his location, because he arranged to be put on permanent display, and he's been sitting in the same chair for nearly 200 years. Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher and founder of utilitarianism, the idea that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the measure of right and wrong, died on June 6, 1832, at the age of 84. In his will, Bentham left detailed instructions for the disposition of his remains. He wanted his body to be dissected in a public anatomy lecture, which it was 2 days after his death, and then preserved as what he called an auto-icon, a permanent display that would serve as a lasting memorial, far more useful than a statue. His skeleton was padded with straw, dressed in his own clothes, and placed in a seated position in a wooden cabinet with glass doors. His head was mummified using techniques from New Zealand, but the process went badly and left it looking ghastly, so a wax head was substituted. The real head was placed between his feet. Bentham's auto-icon has been on display at University College London since 1850, nearly 2 centuries of sitting in a glass case in a university corridor, welcoming visitors and students. The real head was a source of trouble. It was reportedly stolen multiple times by students from rival colleges and once held for ransom, and was eventually locked away. In 2020, the auto-icon was moved to a new, more prominent display location within the university. Stories that Bentham is wheeled into university council meetings and recorded as present but not voting are, regrettably, not true, though the legend persists. Bentham got exactly what he wanted: to be useful, even in death. Bentham knew exactly where he wanted to end up, and there he sits. The next man on our tour also had a plan for his remains, but his generals had other ideas, and 23 centuries later, nobody has found him. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India before the age of 33, died in Babylon, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, on June 10 or 11, 323 BC. He had not named a successor, and his generals immediately began fighting over his empire. The cause of death remains debated 23 centuries later. Typhoid fever complicated by heavy drinking is one leading theory. Poisoning is another. A recent study proposed pancreatitis. According to ancient writers, his body did not show signs of decomposition for several days after death, which some attributed to divine status and others to the preserving effects of the alcohol he had consumed. What happened to his body afterward is one of history's enduring mysteries. According to ancient sources, Alexander's body was preserved in honey and placed in a gold sarcophagus, later replaced by one of glass so that visitors could see the preserved king. A massive, ornate funeral carriage, reportedly so heavy it required 64 mules to pull, was built to carry the body back to Macedonia. But the procession was hijacked en route by Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most ambitious generals, who diverted it to Egypt, where he was establishing his own kingdom. The body was initially placed in Memphis and later moved to Alexandria, the great city Alexander had founded on the Mediterranean coast, where it was displayed in a magnificent tomb known as the Soma. For centuries, the tomb was one of the great attractions of the ancient world. Both Julius Caesar and the Roman Emperor Augustus made pilgrimages to see it. Augustus reportedly accidentally broke off Alexander's nose while touching the preserved body. The Roman Emperor Caligula allegedly stole Alexander's breastplate from the tomb to wear himself. Then the tomb simply disappeared. Sometime around the 4th century AD, during the upheavals of the late Roman Empire, earthquakes, riots, the rise of Christianity, the decline of pagan sites, all records of the tomb's location ceased. Theories about where Alexander's body ended up range from beneath the streets of modern Alexandria to the crypt of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, where some scholars believe Alexander's remains were misidentified as those of the Apostle St. Mark and carried to Venice by merchants in the 9th century. Over 140 formal searches have been conducted over the years. In 2019, a team of archaeologists announced they had found a promising underground structure in Alexandria, but excavation was halted by groundwater and modern construction above. The search continues. The man who conquered the known world in his 20s now lies somewhere beneath the unknown, the most famous lost grave in human history. Alexander the Great has been missing for 16 centuries. The next story makes his disappearance look dignified, because what happened to this man's corpse is, by any standard, one of the most grotesque spectacles in recorded history. Pope Formosus served as head of the Catholic Church from 891 to 896 AD, a turbulent period in which rival Italian aristocratic families fought for control of the papacy, and popes rose and fell with alarming regularity. Formosus had led a complicated life. He had been excommunicated once before being reinstated and eventually elected pope. He died on April 4, 896, and was buried in St. Peter's Basilica. 7 months later, his successor, Pope Stephen VI, acting at the behest of a powerful Roman faction, had Formosus's rotting corpse exhumed from its grave, dressed in full papal vestments, and propped up on a throne in a Roman courtroom. The dead pope was then put on trial for various political and ecclesiastical crimes, including the charge that he had illegally held the office of pope while still technically bishop of another diocese. History remembers the event as the Cadaver Synod, and it remains one of the most grotesque spectacles in the annals of organized religion. A teenage deacon was appointed to stand behind the decomposing corpse and answer questions on its behalf. The outcome was, naturally, a foregone conclusion. Formosus was found guilty on all counts. His papal acts were annulled. The 3 fingers of his right hand that he had used to give papal blessings were cut off, and his body was stripped of its vestments, dragged through the streets of Rome, and thrown into the Tiber River. The body was later recovered downstream by a monk who gave it a proper burial. But the political winds shifted yet again. The Roman populace was outraged by the spectacle, and subsequent popes rehabilitated Formosus, declared the Cadaver Synod invalid, and had Stephen VI, who had orchestrated the whole macabre affair, himself deposed and strangled in prison. The Cadaver Synod remains one of the most bizarre episodes in the history of the papacy. Even by the often brutal standards of medieval Rome, it was considered excessive. Pope Formosus was tried, convicted, and thrown in a river, all while dead. Let's cross the Atlantic now to a story with a happier ending. A naval hero lost in Paris for over a century, and the obsessive search to bring him home. John Paul Jones is considered the father of the American Navy. Born in Scotland, He came to the American colonies and joined the Continental Navy during the Revolutionary War, where he became the young nation's first great naval hero. His most famous moment came during the battle between his ship, the Bonhomme Richard, and the British warship HMS Serapis in September 1779. With his own ship sinking and on fire, the British captain asked if Jones wished to surrender. His reply, "I have not yet begun to fight," became one of the most famous declarations in American military history. Jones went on to capture the Serapis. After the war, he served briefly in the Russian Navy under Catherine the Great, then retired to Paris, where he died on July 18, 1792, at the age of 45, of kidney disease. He was buried in a small cemetery for foreign Protestants on the outskirts of Paris. Because the French Revolution was in full swing, the king would be executed less than 6 months later, and the young American Republic had little money to spare. There was no effort to bring the body home. The cemetery was eventually closed and built over, its grounds swallowed by the growing city. For more than a century, no one knew exactly where Jones was buried. Buildings, streets, and an entire neighborhood had risen above the old graveyard. In 1899, the American ambassador to France, General Horace Porter, began a 6-year search for the body, largely funded out of his own pocket. Porter researched historical records obsessively, identified the probable boundaries of the old cemetery beneath the streets of Paris, and hired workers to dig exploratory tunnels under buildings and courtyards. In 1905, after years of fruitless digging, they finally found a lead coffin. The French burial records had noted that Jones was buried in a lead coffin filled with alcohol to preserve the body, in case the United States ever wanted to retrieve it. That small detail, recorded over a century earlier by a thoughtful French admirer, proved decisive. The body inside was remarkably well preserved. An autopsy confirmed the identification through physical characteristics matching known descriptions of Jones. President Theodore Roosevelt, a man who appreciated naval heroism, dispatched a squadron of 11 warships to France to escort the body home with full military honors. Jones was finally interred in a grand marble and bronze sarcophagus in the crypt of the Naval Academy Chapel at Annapolis, Maryland, in 1913, 121 years after his death in a Paris apartment. John Paul Jones took 121 years to get home. The next liberator on our tour was dug up on live national television by a president who considered himself the dead man's spiritual heir. Simon Bolivar, known as El Libertador, led the independence movements that freed Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia from Spanish rule in the early 19th century. He is revered across South America the way Washington and Jefferson are in the United States. 6 countries regard him as a founding father. Born into a wealthy Creole family in Caracas in 1783, Bolivar spent years fighting Spanish colonial armies across some of the most forbidding terrain on Earth, from tropical jungles to Andean mountain passes. His dream was a united South America, but by the end of his life, the countries he had liberated were fracturing into separate nations and turning against him. He died disillusioned on December 17, 1830, near Santa Marta, Colombia, at the age of 47. The official cause of death was tuberculosis, though some historians have long suspected arsenic poisoning by political enemies. Bolivar was initially buried in the cathedral in Santa Marta. 12 years later, in 1842, his remains were exhumed and transferred to Caracas, Venezuela, where they were placed in the National Pantheon, a former church converted into a mausoleum for national heroes. That should have been the end of his journey, but in 2010, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, who idolized Bolivar and had reshaped his entire government around the liberator's legacy, ordered the body exhumed again, this time on live national television. Chavez was among those who believed Bolivar had been murdered by poisoning, and he wanted forensic testing to prove it. The exhumation was conducted on the night of July 16, 2010, in a dramatic ceremony broadcast to millions of viewers. Chavez himself tweeted about the experience, describing the moment the coffin was opened. Forensic teams from Venezuela, France, and Spain took samples. The results, announced in 2011, were inconclusive. They could neither confirm nor rule out arsenic poisoning. The question of whether Bolivar was murdered remains unanswered, which is perhaps exactly the kind of outcome you'd expect when a political leader orders a forensic investigation designed to support a conclusion he's already reached. Bolivar's remains were placed in a new coffin, designed at Chavez's direction to feature the liberator's face reconstructed from the skull, and returned to the Pantheon, where they remain today. Chavez himself died of cancer 2 years later, in 2013, and was embalmed and placed in a military museum in Caracas, a fate that, intentionally or not, echoes the Lenin mausoleum he had admired. Bolivar's exhumation settled nothing. The next man's remains pose an even bigger puzzle, because after the French Revolution got hold of his body, it's anyone's guess what's actually left. Voltaire, born François-Marie Arouet, was the towering figure of the French Enlightenment, a philosopher, satirist, and tireless champion of civil liberties whose pen terrified kings and churchmen alike. His novella Candide, his philosophical letters, and his campaigns against religious intolerance and judicial abuses influenced the entire trajectory of Western thought and helped lay the intellectual groundwork for the French Revolution. He died on May 30, 1778, at the age of 83, in Paris, having returned to the city after nearly 3 decades of self-imposed exile. Because of his lifelong attacks on the Catholic Church, church authorities tried to deny him a Christian burial in the capital. His friends moved quickly. They smuggled his body out of the city before the order could take effect, and buried him at the Abbey of Céllières in Champagne, where a sympathetic abbot agreed to inter him. In 1791, during the French Revolution, Voltaire was recast as a hero of liberty, the man whose ideas had helped inspire the uprising. His remains were exhumed and transferred to the Pantheon in Paris, the grand mausoleum reserved for France's greatest citizens, in an enormous public ceremony involving hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets. The procession took 12 hours. He was placed in the crypt alongside his philosophical rival Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 2 men who could barely stand each other in life, together for eternity. But during the upheavals that followed, the terror, the counter-revolution, the constant shifts in power, rumors circulated that royalist sympathizers broke into the Pantheon in the dead of night and stole Voltaire's remains, dumping them in a refuse heap or throwing them into the Seine. An investigation in 1897 opened his coffin and confirmed that bones were still present. But whether they were all Voltaire's, or entirely Voltaire's, remained uncertain. Some accounts claim his heart and brain were removed before the transfer to the Pantheon and kept separately as relics. His heart, preserved in a gilded case, is reportedly held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Voltaire's brain was supposedly kept in a private collection and later lost. The man who spent his life questioning everything has left behind a set of remains that raise more questions than they answer. Voltaire's brain may be in a private collection somewhere, or it may be gone forever. The next literary giant fared better. His bones survived, but the city that exiled him has been trying to get them back for 700 years. Dante Alighieri, the author of the Divine Comedy, arguably the most important literary work in the Italian language and one of the greatest poems ever written, a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise that has shaped Western literature for 7 centuries, died in exile on September 14, 1321, at the age of 56, in Ravenna, Italy. Dante had been banished from his beloved Florence in 1302, caught on the wrong side of the brutal factional politics between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. He was sentenced to exile and threatened with death by burning if he ever returned. He spent the rest of his life wandering between Italian cities, dependent on the patronage of various lords. It was during this exile that he wrote the masterwork that would immortalize him. He never saw Florence again. He was buried in Ravenna at the Church of San Francesco. Florence wanted him back almost immediately. For centuries, the city petitioned for the return of Dante's remains, arguing that their greatest son should rest in his hometown, the very city that had driven him out. In 1519, Pope Leo X, himself a Florentine, a member of the powerful Medici family, granted Florence formal permission to take the body. A distinguished delegation was sent to Ravenna. But when they opened Dante's tomb, the coffin was empty. Franciscan friars at the adjoining monastery had anticipated the move and had secretly removed the bones through a hole cut in the wall of the sarcophagus, hiding them inside a bricked-up niche in their monastery. The Florentine delegation returned home empty-handed. The bones stayed hidden for centuries, and as the friars who knew the secret died, their location was forgotten entirely. In 1865, the 600th anniversary of Dante's birth, a workman conducting renovations at the old monastery discovered a wooden box inside a bricked-up wall. Inside were human bones and a Latin inscription identifying them as Dante's, left by a friar in 1677. The bones were authenticated and returned to a small neoclassical mausoleum in Ravenna, where they remain today. Florence has a grand cenotaph, an empty tomb, for Dante in the Basilica di Santa Croce, the same church where Galileo is buried. But the body has never left Ravenna. The city that sheltered Dante in life continues to keep him in death, nearly 700 years later. Florence still has an empty tomb for Dante. Ravenna still has the bones, and neither side shows any sign of budging. Our final story before we wrap up takes us to the other side of the world, to Australia, and an outlaw whose remains proved as hard to pin down as the man himself. Ned Kelly is to Australia roughly what Jesse James is to America, an outlaw who became a folk hero, a symbol of rebellion against authority, a man whose legend far outgrew his crimes. We met Jesse James earlier on this tour, and the parallels are striking. Both came from poor rural families, both turned to crime young, both were betrayed by people close to them, and both became more famous in death than they ever were in life. Kelly, the son of Irish immigrants in the rough colonial countryside of Victoria, became the most wanted man in Australia after killing 3 policemen at Stringybark Creek in 1878. His gang's exploits culminated in the famous siege at Glenrowan in 1880, where Kelly wore his iconic homemade suit of armor into battle, a set of iron plate armor hammered out of plowshares that weighed nearly 100 pounds. The armor protected his torso and head, but his legs were unshielded, and that's where the police bullets finally brought him down. He was captured, tried, and hanged at Melbourne Jail on November 11, 1880, at the age of 25. His reported last words were, "Such is life." Over 30,000 people signed a petition for clemency. It was denied. After the execution, Kelly's body was buried in the prison cemetery. But even in death, people couldn't leave him alone. When the old Melbourne jail was partly demolished in 1929, the remains of executed prisoners were exhumed and moved to a mass grave at Pentridge Prison. Kelly's skull had already gone missing. It had been taken as a souvenir, possibly by a prison official, shortly after his death. It passed through various hands, was allegedly used as a paperweight and a conversation piece at dinner parties, and disappeared entirely for decades. The skull became an object of obsession for collectors and historians. Australia's equivalent of a holy relic, if the saint in question had been a cop killer in homemade armor. In 2009, archaeologists excavated the mass grave at Pentridge Prison to try to identify Kelly's remains. The task was enormous. Dozens of bodies, most unidentified, jumbled together over decades of neglect. After extensive forensic work, including DNA comparison with Kelly's living descendants, his skeleton was positively identified in 2011. His bones, minus the skull, were returned to his family in 2012 and buried in a private ceremony at an undisclosed location in northeastern Victoria, the family choosing secrecy to prevent exactly the kind of disturbance that had plagued his remains for over a century. In 2015, a skull was recovered that some believe to be Kelly's, but its authenticity remains disputed. Like the man himself, Ned Kelly's remains have proved elusive, defiant, and impossible to pin down. We've traveled the world over the course of this documentary, from Springfield, Illinois to Buenos Aires, from the beaches of Italy to the deserts of California, from medieval churches to parking lots. We've encountered grave robbers, body snatchers, souvenir hunters, grieving widows, scheming politicians, and one very determined road manager with a hearse and 5 gallons of gasoline. We've seen bodies dug up for ransom, for science, for political revenge, for DNA testing, and for reasons that no one can fully explain. 40 stories, 40 people who changed the world in ways large and small, and 40 reminders that fame doesn't end at the grave. Sometimes that's where the strangest chapter begins. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, rest in peace.